Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. My name is Robert Abel and I'm the content coordinator for SC Media and your moderator for this program, which is sponsored by Bugcrowd. Our topic is 5 keys to understanding vulnerability disclosure, and our speakers today are Casey Ellis, who is the chairman, founder, and CTO of Bugcrowd, and Jason Haddix, who is the VP of Trust and Security. Now, before we get started, I would like to mention one quick housekeeping item. There will be a question and answer period after the presentation, so please place your questions in the space provided on your screen. 2017 was undoubtedly another year of escalation in size, scope, and scale of cyber attacks. It goes without saying that this past year everyone was impacted by at least one of these breaches, but it's been a year of unprecedented change as well, change for the better. With policies and standards in place, such as the NIST cybersecurity framework, it's now incumbent on organizations to ensure that they are set up to receive vulnerability data from external parties and are already becoming an adhered to standard for major private organizations. With that being said, I'll turn it over to you, Casey and Jason.
Thanks very much. So this is Casey Ellis, the founder and CTO of Bugcrowd speaking. A pleasure to be chatting with all of you today. And thank you for joining this webinar. Really what Jason and I are going to do is to run through some of our key learnings as a business and some of our key kind of, the concepts that we're seeing from the market around vulnerability disclosure and this whole idea of creating and accelerating towards creating an open conversation between the good faith researcher community and the vendors that produce software and are responsible for protecting their users. So by way of agenda, we're going to go through a couple of things. Firstly, like how did we get here? Why are we having this conversation? Then we'll jump straight into the 5 keys that we've laid out around understanding what a vulnerability disclosure program is and some ways to think about how to actually implement these types of programs. And in the back section, we're going to kind of get the crystal ball out and talk a little bit about the future, how this is expected to play out over time in our minds, as well as a bit of a recap around some of the things that we've discussed on this webinar.
Perfect. So my name is Jason Haddix, and I'm the VP of Trust and Security here at Bugcrowd. Bugcrowd is a company delivering a radical cybersecurity advantage throughout the enterprises and through bug bounty solutions and hackers on demand. What we do is we take your typical type of penetration test or a vulnerability disclosure program, and we apply our vetted crowd of researchers to this problem, and we deliver unprecedented results as far as the types of vulnerabilities you see, the coverage that you can get from a security assessment, and we apply this all with our in-house platform and triage team to make it easy for you to handle this information and bring it to your organization.
Yeah, definitely. And in essence, what we've built that on top of, and this is really how Bugcrowd got started, was being able to actually also deliver these vulnerability disclosure programs out to the market. So the whole concept of creating a platform that provides a really easy and consolidated central point for security researchers to submit issues to, get them through to the people that we're working with on the customer side, to their security teams and their engineering teams to fix, and so on, and then use the information and the learnings from running those public programs to be able to deliver this stuff privately as well.
Absolutely. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability disclosure programs and how vital they are to companies managing risk and how people can submit to those vulnerability programs. We're going to outline some key components of what a vulnerability disclosure program is and the recent momentum behind these programs because they've been kind of spurned by different organizations trying to standardize around what these look like. So government agencies are committed to kind of taking vulnerability seriously now because of all these events that have taken place in the last few years. So adding policy and transparency to these efforts will really bolster the community. They'll help our researchers, the researchers in the security community, have a safe way to report vulnerabilities to brands and enterprises that really need them to be the first line of defense for their applications and their assets online.
Absolutely. So in terms of, really why we're here and I think why this whole thing is happening, like the truth of it is that vulnerability disclosure as a model has been around for almost as long as the internet. Since people started creating software, folks like the folks that Bugcrowd work with, like many of the team like Jason and myself, have been, looking at this software, finding ways to get it to do what it shouldn't do. And some of the time when you do that, you end up with security vulnerabilities. So the kind of concept of breakers stepping in and stepping up to the table to help builders is actually quite an old one. But in terms of the recent rise of vulnerability and vulnerability disclosure programs and bug bounty programs, we see it as kind of the confluence of a couple of different forces. The first is the status quo. There's a combination of an incredible shortage of resources out there in the market when you think about things like penetration testing and security consulting. And then you add to that the fact that you're expecting one person being paid by the hour to compete against a crowd of adversaries to really find a vulnerability first, because ultimately the first person who finds these types of issues is the one who gets to decide what's done with them. You add to that the increasing cadence of active, efficient adversaries out there. You only need to look at the paper to know that that's true, so we won't drill into that too far. But then also the fact that people are continuing to put everything that they can think of on the internet with the advent of IoT and connected vehicles, for example, as well as closer to the enterprise. This whole idea of putting business systems online to make them more accessible, sure, it makes it more useful for your customers and for your partners and so on, but it also makes it more exposed to the adversary. So the whole idea of understanding on a continuous basis where you're vulnerable, fixing those issues as they're found, and then ideally improving your ability to not reintroduce those types of issues in the future, that's getting more imperative. And I tapped on it before, but the whole idea of there's not enough good people to go around. There's 370,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs in the US alone right now, and I think when you consider the scale of the conflict almost that we're in, like defender versus attacker, we're basically outgunned from a human resourcing standpoint. We need human creativity to find these types of issues. People write software, people deploy code, so human creativity is an integral part of identifying these types of issues. And really, these three things, or four things rather, coming together is what has pushed the internet as a whole to look out to the good faith hacker or the white hat researcher community and ask for help, because the truth of it is they've been wanting to help the entire time. It's good to see that happen.
Absolutely. So we're going to run into kind of 5 keys to understanding vulnerability disclosure programs here. We've kind of broken down what we have seen as a company helping a lot of large enterprises and small enterprises as well run VDP programs, and we've taken that as well as all the frameworks that are coming out and kind of boiled it down to what key components you need, and then some advice around that, and we prepared that today for you.
All right, so let's start with definitions, and I think this is a really important place to start. I'm a huge fan of starting with why as a concept and then going down from there. When you think about what vulnerability disclosure is, the way I like to describe it is it's like neighborhood watch for the internet. So in essence, what vendors and the people that are building software and protecting user data and so on are doing through the creation of a vulnerability disclosure program is going out to the broader internet and saying, hey, those of you who have skills and understanding when it comes to security and can identify issues that might create risk for us or our users, we'd like you to tell us. We actually want to invite you to go looking in some cases for those types of things. And if you find them, here are the different things that we've put in place to allow you to get that information to us. If you do that, here are the commitments that we make in terms of how we're going to interact with you. Those can include things like legal safe harbor and so on, but as well as that, it's really making sure and committing to a response. The thing to call out here is that every disclosure program is different. I think there's commonalities to all of them that we'll tap on here, but when it comes down to it, every individual organization is different in its requirements, and there's going to be a degree of uniqueness to all of these. So that's important to tap on there. Ultimately, the core ingredients, this is really how you bake the cake, and this is how we think about it. There's 3 core ingredients to every program, and these are the things that they all share. The first is a communication channel. That can look like a whole bunch of different things. Traditionally, it's been security at email addresses as mandated by RFC 2142 and other standards. The challenge to that as this whole concept has evolved is that email is not a really ideal medium for coordination of information like this. So you're starting to see different models in terms of how people approach vulnerability intake from the community, embedded forms on websites, using platforms like ours, creating their own intake systems and their own platforms in-house. Essentially, the key part about this is that you need to have a channel that the security researchers that are out there in the community are going to initially submit an issue to, and then you need that coordination to continue along that same channel to make sure that the communication is kept healthy and safe and clean and so on. The second part is really the policy, and this is ultimately the contract that a company produces and presents out to the internet that sets out the scope, sets out the different expectations that I mentioned before, that hackers that are trying to participate can basically count on from them, but they also set the parameters of engagement. So as you probably know, hacking without permission or hacking in a malicious sense is broadly outlawed and in a lot of areas federally illegal. Part of what the policy does is actually create safe harbor for the hackers to be able to say, okay, if I follow these particular rules, this company agrees not to pursue any sort of civil or criminal action against me. And also, these are the things they're going to do about trying to fix the issues that I find. And then the third, which I think is really important, is the process. It's no good just having a policy in the channel. You need to have people to actually deal with the intake of all of these issues that come in from the internet. That's when management and the triage components of these programs becomes really critical. And then on the back end, you need to be thinking about the processes that you're going to instantiate within your organization to make sure that these issues actually get fixed, because it's no good finding out that there's a problem if you're not in a position to actually resolve that problem as it comes up. So ultimately, channel, policy, and process, these are the three ingredients that are common to pretty much every program that we see.
Absolutely. And so for the first section of kind of that cake and the first layer in that cake, there are multiple options for vulnerability intake when it comes to VDPs this day and age. So first, you have your potential vulnerability reported. This can either be by a researcher actively looking because you have this policy, or because they use your site and they're a customer of your site and they happen to have security skills, or just a user has stumbled upon some type of bug. So you have to have a way to take in this bug. And so the three that Casey mentioned very briefly is three that are kind of most often utilized right now. So the first is an email intake. And so the email intake is a security email address, usually for your organization. So the researcher would send an email to that email box with the details of the vulnerability. The other area that you can use here is a hosted form. And so the hosted form, we're going to show in a second, one of our examples, is just an embedded form like an iframe that structures the vulnerability information and asks questions about the vulnerability, and it sits up on your web page on a page like Flash Security, and people can submit vulnerability data to that form. And the other one is to use a platform like Bugcrowd. And so you would host your whole vulnerability disclosure page on Bugcrowd sites along with a directory of hundreds of other companies who are doing the same thing as you, and you utilize us as a platform to funnel people into your vulnerability disclosure program. Now that can go, those intake channels go into a system like ours called Crowd Control, and Crowd Control manages the whole bug tracking lifecycle, as well as applies deduplication and response triggers and everything like that. And it goes off to Bugcrowd's expert validation team. And what's important here in this vulnerability intake cycle is that you might get a potential large intake of vulnerabilities here. Many vulnerabilities from tens to hundreds to many hundreds basically. And so what you need is someone to cut down the signal to noise. You don't end up dealing with spam and duplicates and things that aren't relevant. So you have that open channel, but you don't want to inundate yourself with too many reports. So what Bugcrowd's triage and validation does, and the platform helps do, is basically risk rate all those vulnerabilities that come in and validate them and deduplicate them. And so what this does is it allows your organization to achieve 100% signal from the intake, basically. And then behind this, there's a whole bunch of work that you have to do with policy and stakeholders on the internal side to validate yourself and to prioritize between teams. And this is all work that we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So this is an example of an embedded submission form here. And so this is one of our customers, one login, and so they have embedded Bugcrowd's embedded submission form. So here, if you zoom in a little bit, you can see that they have a responsible disclosure basically text blob here at the top about what their responsible disclosure policies are. And then they have a structured set of data here that they want people to fill in. And what this does is this allows researchers or customers or anybody really dealing with your software to report safely through the form, as well as give you structured data, which makes the whole process of reproducing and prioritizing this data, this vulnerability intake data, it makes it much easier for your team to forward internally instead of an unstructured form like email, which is still one of the primary forms, but this is a far superior form of intake. So it's not just tech companies. Traditionally, we've talked about, when you talk about vulnerability disclosure, you've talked about tech companies, the oldest ones are, Netscape and Mozilla and Google and Facebook. It's not just tech companies anymore doing vulnerability disclosure programs. I think over the past few years, we've had so many breaches and so many security events that could have just been mitigated by having one place to submit types of bugs like this, security issues. And so we really have seen the industry grow a lot in the last couple of years, as well as moving towards standardization as what this looks like. So we have a ton of customers here who are utilizing a VDP solution, a vulnerability disclosure program solution. Some of our best VDP customers are companies like OneLogin or HubSpot or Indeed, Motorola, Cisco, Walmart. But a ton of customers are utilizing this model just to make sure they have a first line of communication in defense and to make sure that people can have a place to go when they have a security issue.
Absolutely. And this extends out to organizations that decide after time with their vulnerability disclosure program that they'd like to add a cash incentive and create a bug bounty program and start to direct the behavior of the good faith hackers that are participating. The thing that is really important to call out on this slide is that this is about, these are only the public programs that we run. So about 30% of the clientele the Bugcrowd has right now is public. The rest of it's private. And what's interesting in terms of adoption is, as Jason said, this started off in very much the aggressive early adopting, technology companies, primarily in the Bay Area, back in the early 2000s and forward from there. But what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is this incredibly rapid adoption horizontally out into the more, quote unquote, traditional verticals, because they all have vulnerabilities too. And we'll get to some of the reasons why there's additional pressure on them to actually adopt this model.
Absolutely. So a quick slide here on VDP and bug bounties, because sometimes these two types of things get conflated. And we wanted to kind of outline the differences here between what a VDP is and a bug bounty. So the main difference between a VDP and a bug bounty is monetary reward for a submission of vulnerability data. So a bug bounty gives you monetary rewards as a researcher. You're therefore incentivized to test for these monetary rewards. There's a whole ecosystem, a burgeoning ecosystem of doing this type of crowdsourced assessment that we facilitate here at Bugcrowd. But a VDP is not incentivized with cash or anything like that. So the incentives are basically say something, so that the company that you're working for, or the enterprise that you use, is more secure. And there's a lot of researchers who have been working in this model for many, many years, through things like full disclosure or existing security at email boxes. So there's always a formal intake channel for this type of thing in VDP. And what that means is that the intake channel defines what you're going to be testing. So in a VDP, the scope is almost always open. It basically says, we as an organization want to know any security vulnerability that has to do with any of our assets or brand, and you can report that. Whereas a bug bounty program might be scoped very much like a security assessment, which it says we only want to know application vulnerabilities related to this one site. So a VDP is an open door, whereas a bug bounty program is a very niche funnel. The VDP also allows for ongoing security testing. Oh, go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, I was going to say, this goes back to the neighborhood watch description that we were kind of calling out before, because as Jason pointed out, like the core difference in my mind between a bug bounty program and a VDP, aside from the fact that VDP doesn't have cash and bug bounty does, is that with a bug bounty program, really what you're doing is you're proactively incentivizing the kinds of things that you want. And there's an element of, directive kind of information and directive interaction that the vendors set up with the hacker community to make sure that they're getting the information that's most relevant to them. With a VDP, you get the same sorts of benefits in terms of engaging the broader community and creating this feedback loop. But the idea of it is for it to be as we said before, more of a neighborhood watch. It's open. It's going out there and saying, okay, like there are people out there on the internet that can help me with this stuff. I want them to tell me when there's something wrong. If there's something that I'm missing, I want to give them a clear channel to actually communicate that to me. And here's the things I'll do if they follow that process.
Absolutely. And one of the things about VDP is that it can lead right into a crowdsourced security testing solution like a bug bounty program. And so things that VDP are good at are identifying and prioritizing assets and finding assets you didn't know you had, helping you prioritize vulnerability types within applications, so then you can really focus on that application with the bug bounty. So VDP is part of a crawl, walk, run life cycle. It fits somewhere in the first two phases. And can take you right into a bug bounty program that is very pointed and incentivized, where you'll get massive uptick on the type of vulnerabilities and basically get a really good incentivized test, crowdsourced security test.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the policy piece for a second here. As we mentioned earlier on, this is one of the key ingredients to a vulnerability disclosure program. And essentially what it is the contract that a vendor is creating between themselves and good faith hackers out there in the community that basically frames up the behavior and the expectations that follow on from that. And as you can imagine, there's a few challenges to this because firstly, these are two groups of people that historically haven't gotten along all that well. The hackers out in the internet and the vendors that are trying to defend their software. There's a fairly rich and well-known history of some of the instances where those interactions have gone wrong. So there's this initial hurdle to overcome, which basically involves building trust on both sides to make sure that this conversation can happen productively. The second part is that this is a conversation that happens at fairly massive scale, and it's not always with people that are legal experts, and it's not always with people that even have English as their first language. So, in terms of constructing a policy that achieves the business objectives of the security team of the vendor, make sure that it is legally complete for both sides and is providing safe harbor for both the vendor and the hacker who's considering participation. But then also is as easy to understand and as approachable as possible to make sure that these sorts of issues of misunderstanding and scale don't come into play and cause accidental problems. This is a challenge that a bunch of folk have been working on for quite a long time. So the first example of an example kind of boilerplate disclosure policy is the one that Bugcrowd actually created on an open source basis back in 2014 in partnership with a bunch of IP attorneys. We're in the process of actually rebooting that. So I suggest if you're considering this, that you watch that space and see how it evolves over the next couple of months, because ultimately, what we'd like to see happen is for there to be a generally accepted standard right across the board that everyone agrees with. It's not just a Bugcrowd idea. It's got buy-in from all sorts of different aspects of the industry. And ultimately, that's going to simplify these conversations as they go forward and as more people adopt this model. Some of the others is, the DOJ framework for vulnerability disclosure. That's a fantastic document that the folks in Washington released a couple of months back that basically goes through these core ingredients from their perspective. And, these are the people that get swung in on civil and criminal cases when this type of thing goes wrong, as well as doing a whole bunch of outreach to the hacker community to actually help understand what their drives and requirements are, where the chilling effects might be that might get in the way of security research, and actually promote the fact that they're really on the side of making a safer internet, which involves actually engaging the hacker community. So I do recommend that one. The others that are in the mix here, the ISO standards that Katie Mazuris and others have worked on, are a fantastic piece of documentation to look at in terms of best practice. The 18F Vulnerability Disclosure Playbook is a very practical read. And the NTIA is a pretty amazing group also out at DC that essentially gets a whole bunch of different stakeholders from a whole bunch of different angles and tries to create consensus and actually boil out consensus around the best approaches to this type of thing. So if you're looking at this stuff, it may look like a lot of reading. Some of it I think is shorter and some of it's longer than the others, but I do recommend at least taking a visit to some of these sites and some of these policies and guidelines and getting an understanding of the historical work that's gone into trying to make this even more successful.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about how VDPs augment existing vulnerability discovery, right? So you may have things like DAS scanners that you're using to scan external websites, or red teams or vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management teams, or applications that do this type of work for you. And so what you end up doing when you implement a VDP is drastically increasing the effectiveness of your discovery. And this is not only discovery of vulnerabilities, but also discovery of assets. One thing is really interesting about VDPs when you open them up, since they have such a wide scope, you end up with a lot of researchers finding things that we would predominantly call shadow IT, sites that you didn't know that you had, maybe marketing stood up or another business unit stood up, or maybe endpoints that you thought were depreciated that actually didn't get removed offline, or cloud assets. So what happens a lot is one of the powerful things here is VDP discovers those types of assets and brings them to the forefront of your vulnerability management cycle, and you can actually prioritize them now inside of your vulnerability process, basically.
Most definitely.
Did you have a word on that?
Yeah, just to tap on that a little bit more. This concept of shadow IT, the two things that we see, and the two things that we've observed, people that are running programs even off the Bugcrowd platform around this model is the historical assets that are out there on the internet that they've forgotten about, and the new ones that are hitting the public attack surface so quickly that they can't govern them. So like this historical kind of shadow IT component, as well as the present and future piece. This whole idea of getting more eyes incentivized and really directed to go and have a look. Like, let's find out where there's unknown attack surface. What we've seen in the community is that that's some of the stuff that they're best at actually going after. And the overall reduction of risk is pretty incredible. Like some of the biggest breaches over the past 5 years or so have actually been as a result of, for example, developer machines that haven't been switched off after development, and so on. So the whole idea of making sure that, again, you're engaging Neighborhood Watch and the people that can identify when those types of mistakes or oversights have been made, so that you can remediate them. That's one of the key benefits of this whole process.
Absolutely, yeah. And the thing about the researchers that participate in these VDP programs or any crowdsourced security assessment is really what happens is they all bring their individual skill sets and talents to your program, to your VDP. And so a lot of these researchers or testers are very well versed in discovering not only assets, but also credentials left online in things like GitHub, or subdomains that you may have let out there and things like that. So there's a lot of really cool things that come out of VDPs that help you prioritize your risk. There's also the fact that the VDP augments your vulnerability discover by just giving you a framework for engaging and maintaining a relationship with your security community. So this is actually one of the most important things. The worst thing that can happen is that you have some type of security issue. There's no way for a researcher to contact you whatsoever. It gets lost in your customer service portal, and this has happened time and time again. And the researcher has a frustrating experience trying to just operate in good faith and be a good person and give you this security information, probably for a site that they found a vulnerability on because they are a customer of yours. So this provides them a framework and fast communication to get to someone on the right side, and you're only receiving the prioritized stuff because you can have this managed by a company like Bugcrowd in the middle. And so now you can augment. Yeah, you can also augment this kind of stuff with your with the frameworks that we have here. So some of the frameworks that Casey mentioned on the last slide actually have detailed flow maps of how this vulnerability moves through the life cycle of your business, not just the intake portion. And so this helps you just basically ramp up your vulnerability discovery program with new tools and new process. It really makes things faster and easier to work with inside of the organization. And then the last one
to consider there is the fact that the thing to consider there is the fact that these programs are actually starting to become mandated by some of these policies and processes. Like the fact that vulnerability disclosure is a part of the NIST standard. It's proposed rather as a draft within NIST, but by all accounts it looks like it'll be accepted. If that happens, it's going to become basically mandated within the federal government and will trickle down into the corporate world fairly soon after that. So this is one of the reasons why we wanted to put this webinar on. We do expect that this is something that pretty much everyone who's listening right now is going to have to figure out how to deal with at some point in the future, and being proactive about getting these things in place is certainly a better scenario than trying to be reactive.
Absolutely. And the other thing about this is that it just demonstrates from a community point of view your commitment to security. A lot of people can pay a lot of lip service to,
Yeah.
We care about security, right? But when you have one of these things out there and at least you have a communication channel open and it's being managed appropriately and timelines are being met and the process has been instituted, really does show that you care about security and that your organization is forward-thinking and in a mature state for vulnerability disclosure. So these are the types of programs people like to help and like to submit vulnerabilities for because it not only demonstrates that you are good in security, but you're also a good product looking forward to making the internet kind of like a safer place.
Absolutely.
Great. So we talked a little bit about bolstering the lifecycle vulnerability management. So now we're going to talk about program management and why it's so vital for a VDP. And we hit on a couple of these points. But remember, the three ingredients to the cake are channel, policy, and process, which was mentioned earlier. And so the internal process here is also really important. We've talked a lot about the intake and how the intake works and how you respond to the researcher. But it's really vital to designate someone internally, a team or a partner, to provide some kind of management and filtering and expert technical review of these submissions so that they can move through to your development team quickly or to the application owners very quickly. A lot of times what we'll see is large organizations come to Bugcrowd who have many different business units. And so the first activity we do when we start up a VDP for a program or for a program of ours or for a customer of ours is we have to break down how internally their business works and how the application teams work and what tools they're using and how we forward valid instances of vulnerability data to them. What systems are they using? How can we integrate with those systems? And so really what you need is a key stakeholder in the middle that glues the intake to the teams, especially if you're a large business. And so we do this constantly with our customers, outlining basically how they work internally, making sure response channels are quick and SLAs are tight, and that nothing ever falls through the cracks. And so this leads to basically one-on-one communication between the stakeholder, which is either in some cases Bugcrowd or in some cases the customer, right to the researchers. It's quick. They get better context and higher engagement on these security vulnerabilities so that the bad things don't happen. And then the last part of it is once you have a really well thought out submission of vulnerability data and a really good curated relationship with the researcher, then all of that information, including the technical information and the context around it from the researcher, needs to go to the back end of the engineering team that's going to do the remediation. And so the communication process is paramount there as well. So really, channel, policy, and process is what we're talking about. And Casey, I'm going to open this one up to you as well.
Look, I think this is really where the rubber hits the road. The concept of making sure that the channel, the policy, and the process is planned ahead, is dialed in. Where there's opportunity to go out to the internet and look at some of the policies and frameworks that we mentioned just before, or the opportunity to engage an expert like Bugcrowd to help you out. This is really where it's going to rise and fall. Like, the preparation is everything on these programs, and I do think it's important to reinforce the fact that this is not a trivial undertaking. It's something that you should take seriously. Ultimately, we believe that vulnerability disclosure is going to become quite a ubiquitously adopted model for cybersecurity across the market. But that's not to say that it's trivial and it's something that you just switch on and hope for the best. We believe that going through some of these things that Jason's just run through is really a critical piece of the pre-work in terms of managing and maximizing the success of the program, both when it launches, but then also as it runs over time.
Absolutely. And what you gain out of the program management and kind of being the key stakeholder for these organizations is really operational and technical insights around your security posture. So we work with a lot of clients, and this is just kind of story time here, but we work with a lot of clients who really we end up having to build an asset inventory with, and we work with them to build an asset inventory from their VDP, and then from that we work on escalation paths, and then from that we work on policy and business unit mapping, and so and then from there we end up taking data about the vulnerability about the vulnerabilities that have been submitted and end up creating things like run books for their teams and what are the common remediation things and make sure that they don't have regressions of vulnerabilities later on down the life cycle. So these are all things that you can gain from really good program management inside of the VDP kind of process.
Absolutely.
Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about the impact and kind of the future vulnerability disclosure here, and I'm going to go ahead and let you talk about kind of the prediction part, Casey.
Yeah, for sure. So part of my role as founder is to try to figure out what's inevitable and then get the timing right. And obviously, as we've built out as a team with Bugcrowd, there's folks like Jason and others within the business that are even better at that than the founding team here at Bugcrowd. One of the things that we're all in pretty violent agreement on is that, as a prediction, if you're in security and you intend to stay in security as a practitioner, you're going to be expected to work with external security researchers at scale at some point in your career, which begs the conclusion, that now is the good time to be proactive about figuring out how to do this well, as opposed to, being at some point in the future being asked to do it reactively or even, being in the position where you're having a vulnerability disclosed and you're not quite sure what to do about it. I firmly believe that's true. One of the reasons for that we actually call out in one of the points here, ultimately the adoption of this model is being driven from all sorts of different angles. It's being driven top down through legislation and through the adoption of vulnerability disclosure into security and compliance standards. For example, one of the first questions that Equifax was actually asked in the House committee was, do you have a vulnerability disclosure program in place? So the level of awareness and now the level of introduction of this concept into proper legislation from the top down is accelerating, especially in the US, but we're starting to see that elsewhere in the world as well. From a peer standpoint, Jason mentioned before that there is an element of visibility and marketability to making this statement out to the internet. It is a very visible security control that you can put in place that basically anyone on the internet can understand. You don't need to be a security expert to get the concept of neighborhood watch for the internet. And if you're one of a cohort of companies within an industry and you're the last one to adopt this model, you're probably going to take it on. So we're starting to see that actually play out in terms of the peer pressure cohort that's driving adoption. I think as well from the bottom up, it's not just the consumer who is starting to call vendors more to account around the security and the safety of their products. It's also the hackers that are trying to help out. There's a lot of instances where there's researchers that are reaching out to organizations proactively in spite of there not being a policy in place and saying, hey, I've found an issue. What are you going to do about it? And by the way, you should have a vehicle to get this kind of input from the internet in the future as well. So, that's sort of the sum point of why I believe this is going to be ubiquitous over time. And I do actually think that the adoption of this type of model, we've seen it accelerate, but I actually believe it's going to tip over the next 18 to 24 months because of that viral nature of it, because of the public aspect of how it operates and the fact that, it is a very clear proxy indicator of security maturity that can be seen quite easily from all sorts of different sides. More broadly speaking, I think the fact that these hackers that are involved and the people that we work with on a daily basis at Bugcrowd, they've been at the table for a long time now. And I mentioned this earlier. This is a community that I think has been mostly maligned for the past 20 years, but over the past 5, what we've seen is industry and organizations like ourselves and others actually do a bunch of really good work to call out the concept of there being, almost like a digital locksmith group out there on the internet, like people that would make incredibly competent burglars, but they don't want to. They actually want to help. They don't want to cause harm. Then there's the fact that cybersecurity vulnerabilities, they're inevitable. They're a product of human creativity, so you can't just pretend that they're going to go away. You need to anticipate their existence, find out where they are, fix them, and then try to avoid them in the future. And obviously vulnerabilities create risk of data breach, and data breach, as we've seen over the past couple of years in particular, has incredible impact on particularly the user, but also on the companies as well. And finally, really, this is going to be a mandated standard. I think going back to this whole idea of legislation and inclusion of vulnerability disclosure in things like NIST, and seeing that grandfathered into stuff like PCI and GDPR and so forth, that's something that we can expect to continue going forward. So ultimately, this goes back to one of the points that we made at the beginning of the webinar. This is not just a tech company thing. As we go forward, basically every organization is a tech company in some form, and by extension of that, creating this builder-breaker feedback loop between vendor and the good faith hacker is going to become very imperative.
Absolutely, and one of the stories here that just came out a couple days ago was the Panera Bread story, and so this was an instance where a researcher basically had found a vulnerability using the site as a consumer and had security skills, and ended up noticing that one of the endpoints of the company provided a whole bunch of personal information. And what they did is they tried to responsibly disclose it, and the first failing of on this specific one was that there was no security at email box for him to even email to. There was nowhere on the site. He ended up having to go through a customer support portal that didn't know how to handle this and let it sit. And you fast forward 8 months later of frustration, finally basically soliciting people on LinkedIn trying to submit this vulnerability, and then a really bad feedback loop as far as communications go. Objectively, it was a really hard thing for the researcher to even, in good faith, give this company this vulnerability, and it ended up that it ended up online, and he had to disclose online, like we did many years ago, and things like full disclosure and stuff like that. So, even some small things that we've talked about in this webinar, like a concrete intake channel, things like management that make sure that the researchers get constant communication, that there's expectations set in your vulnerability disclosure brief or page. These kind of things can basically mitigate those types of incidents when you're working with security researchers. In fact, either one of those implemented would have probably taken care of that specific instance. So this is a very real thing that's happening to enterprises all over the world, and so it's really important to get ahead of the curve when it comes to vulnerability disclosure. It's a simple solution, a little bit of complex implementation, but really has tremendous payoffs to an organization to not end up in the news feed, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to that particular example with Panera Bread, full disclosure, which is essentially the behavior when a hacker releases details of vulnerability to the public in order to force the vendor to fix the issue, it's not ideal by any stretch of the imagination. I actually do think it's a necessary ingredient to have in the equation. I don't think it should be illegal or anything like that. But if we're getting to a point where full disclosure is the only route forward, either the security researcher or frankly more likely the vendor is doing something wrong. And that thing that they're doing wrong is actually probably pretty simple to fix over time, like compared to the headache and the hassle caused by going through crisis management with PR, obviously the remediation of the issue itself, dealing with the other hackers that jump in on the mix trying to find other issues, and the malicious attackers that jump in trying to exploit them. When you compare the overhead and the cost and the burden, so to speak, of implementing a vulnerability disclosure program against all of that headache that I just mentioned, I'm biased on this, but I would prefer to take the program. But I think that's a fairly logical equation to draw. So, that's one of those issues where there is a lot of history behind this, and what we're seeing happen over time. This is obviously what Bugcrowd's a part of, but not just based on what we're doing, just in the industry in general. The adoption of this model and moving from a back foot reactive approach to becoming more proactive about actually rolling out the red carpet, setting expectations, creating a channel, and making sure that those processes are in place is becoming more of a standard thing to do, and we'll continue to accelerate over time.
Absolutely. So just to reiterate kind of the points we made before we get into some Q&A time. So we've basically talked about creating a channel for security feedback. These were things like a hosted solution by a third party like Bugcrowd, a hosted solution on your own site, which means like an embedded submission form, something like Bugcrowd offers, or even a security at email box that you use to intake vulnerability. And then the next key is developing that policy and setting clear expectations and protections for the researchers. We talked about this a little bit, but it's a really important part of this feedback loop and this design of a VDP. Nobody wants to end up on the side of litigation or anything like that, so you want to make sure that if someone's going to report in good faith security information to your organization out of altruism, that they have safe harbor protections for the researchers and clear instructions on how to report the vulnerability. And so what this does is you get a whole bunch of vulnerabilities from the market, and it helps you augment your existing security applications. We talk about application security programs, and how this augments them. And now you can prioritize, basically your applications, your assets, and your security program from the data that you get from the VDP. So kind of reiterating all the points we've gone through so far on the webcast. So we do have some kind of print resources here for you guys. We have the 6 questions to ask before implementing a vulnerability disclosure program, and what are the key benefits of a vulnerability disclosure program. These are 2 pieces of content that we've created just to kind of bring in-house, and the links will be provided to everyone. But these will help you, at least have introductory reading material for, how you set these up, as well as you can review this webinar and look at all the standards that we've referenced and everything else in the beginning of the program. And you can also, put all that together to create your own flavor of what vulnerability disclosure looks like. As always, Bugcrowd manages a lot of vulnerability disclosure programs. So if you have any questions on how to implement one of these, I really recommend you give us a call. We can guide you through what we've done in the past, what has worked for different segments of the market, and then help you kind of design one of these things and manage it for you. So now we have some time for some questions here.
Q&A.
All right.
Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. First question for today is, if the researchers for a vulnerability disclosure program are not incentivized, how do I know that I can gather their interest?
That's a great question. The reality of it is that they aren't as interested as they are when there's cash involved. So, there is obviously the need to eat and the need for cash to be able to facilitate that. That's a fairly simple equation. But I think to extend that and assume that there is no incentive whatsoever without cash is also wrong. When you think about this community, they've been wanting to do this type of thing forever, pretty much since the internet was born, and it's part of their inherent nature as hackers and as people who want to tear things apart, put them back together, think like a criminal but not be one, all of those types of things. That in and of itself is an incentive. On top of that, again, this is going back through history and some of the different VDP programs that have run since long before Bugcrowd was a thing. For example, the Microsoft MSRC program, they had a Hall of Fame and still do. That was a huge badge of pride. Not just as an ego or a bragging point, but also as a tool that people have used to basically demonstrate their skills and put on their resume and so forth. So there is incentive already in place. Is it a bug bounty? No, because there's no cash. Does cash increase that incentive? Yes. But does that mean that offering this type of program without cash is useless? Definitely not.
Yeah, there's definitely some different type of incentives too, right? So on the Bugcrowd platform, when we run a VDP, there is the leaderboard that shows that you've worked on a program. And so when you've worked on a vulnerability disclosure program and you found something that's valid, and the company took it, basically you get points for the Bugcrowd basically leaderboard system, and then you also get mentioned on a Hall of Fame, which is kind of what we've been doing, via mailing lists and privately on certain companies. Like Cisco has a thank you page. Many companies have like this Hall of Fame page, Facebook and stuff like that. So really there is some incentive. It's mostly based around bragging rights, or some people use it to bolster their resume. I see a lot of resumes come in from security engineers lately that say they are on some of these leaderboards, or or they have experience testing some of these multinational sites or something like that. So definitely there is some incentive to participate, but that's not the main goal. The main goal is to have an open door and the internet watch type of thing for your programs.
All right, thank you. Our next question. What are the true benefits of a vulnerability disclosure program?
Another good one. Look, from my perspective, the true benefit, we've talked about finding bugs and those types of things, and that's definitely a huge benefit. To me, the bigger and probably deeper benefit is the fact that the reason vulnerabilities exist in the first place is that people that build software aren't necessarily security experts, and they're thinking as builders, not as breakers. So they're, as a software engineer, it's hard enough to get this thing that you're building to do what it's meant to do without also getting it not to do all of the things it shouldn't. And I think the key thing, the real value in both a vulnerability disclosure program and when you start to add incentives with the bug bounty program is you create this feedback loop between people with a breaker mindset and those who are doing the building with a builder mindset. And ultimately, over time, what happens is that knowledge starts to transfer between the two. You don't end up with an engineering team that's necessarily preoccupied or 100% security focused, but what you do end up with is a group of people that are just that little bit more mindful of the fact that, security matters. Like here are simple, practical things that we can do to make our infrastructure, our code, our applications more secure. And by the way, if we fail to take these steps, then a real adversary can come along and actually exploit them and create a breach. So that whole idea of just creating an awareness of the fact that vulnerabilities do matter, and that there is a real threat from the internet that can come in and actually exploit those types of oversights. I think that's the key benefit.
I think that one of the things here is if you bring it way up to a view of, if in the future state everybody had a vulnerability disclosure program, and followed the kind of prescriptive guide for what we've outlined here, the internet would just be a mightily more safer place, right? If every company, big and small, had an intake process for vulnerabilities, like there's just not enough security practitioners to go around, right? There's only so many consultancies, there's only so many security engineers on those bench, there's only so many engineering organizations who have some security experience to help with the security problem inside of your organization. We just don't scale to the massive amount of industry that's out there and the massive amount of IT and technology out there that needs to be secured, right? And Casey said it, we're always going to have vulnerabilities. It's never going to become a problem that we can completely automate out of. And so this is the first step to securing the internet, really, is everybody adopts this kind of program. And that's what we want to see in the future, is that, see something neighborhood watch type of program.
Yep, exactly.
All right, our next question. Even after I pay, how can I be sure researchers do not disclose what they have found publicly?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Even after I pay, how can I be sure that researchers do not disclose what they have found publicly?
So in a pay model, that would be more of a bug bounty. And so a pay model with a bug bounty has certain contractual agreements on the testers, and when you get to a bug bounty model, you want to make sure the testers are vetted so that you don't have to deal with the disclosure or anything like that. Now, for a VDP, you have basically an open scope, right? And so disclosure is definitely something that could happen. And what you're doing is you're mitigating the likelihood of disclosure by offering all of these methods. Some companies that we work with run all three of the methods for intake, which is email, embedded submission form, and on our platform, right? And so you're mitigating a lot of the opportunity for things to go wrong with the researcher community. And so really researchers want to do the right thing. Like when polled, even gray hat hackers say they would most likely like to work with a company to get a vulnerability resolved than do anything else with it, just because basically that's what the security engineer in them wants them to do. So there will be instances always of public disclosure. That's not going to go away, but the more you move towards this end of the spectrum where you're responsibly managing everything, you're working in communication with the researcher, and you really treat them like a resource of your own, right? You're working with them instead of against them. you won't face a lot of those problems. And we've found some statistics basically internally with our researcher operations group, but we have a whole group here at Bugcrowd which does just this. And they help us manage our VDPs and communications with our researchers. It's called researcher operations. And when they do this, they have some really great statistics and NPS scores with the researchers. And so the amount of time that we see an incident is in less than a 1% on a managed VDP program here at Bugcrowd.
100%. I think the other thing to call out there as well is, and again going back to this this whole Panera Bread thing that just happened, this happens anyway, and it's been happening anyway again for a very long time. Like you look at lists like Full Disclosure and some of those different kind of forums where security researchers have gone out and found issues and basically just disclosed them. Sometimes in bad faith, oftentimes in good faith. But this idea of vulnerability disclosure programs actually increasing your risk of that type of disclosure, I think is sort of a moot point. It's a concern that we do hear from a lot of people, but when you consider how frequently and how often this has been happening in the absence of this type of model over the past 10 or 20 years, you kind of have to revisit that question and really ask if it's the right priority to have. I think for the vendors and from their perspective, their priority should be very much focused around the reduction of risk. Like if a vulnerability is there, you can't find it if it's not there. So it's like, okay, let's find these things, let's resolve them, let's reduce the risk of our customers, and in doing so, reduce the risk of other things like disclosure of an unpatched bug and so forth.
All right. For VDPs, what is the value of having open scope versus doing a bug bounty with clearly defined scope?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to, and I'll use the opportunity to reiterate the difference between the two. A bug bounty, obviously there's cash involved, but I think the reason for doing it is not just rewarding and thanking and incentivizing repeat attention from the researchers. It's also to direct their efforts to particular areas of risk that are most important to the business. So it's almost more about like arbitrage of human intelligence than it is about creating some sort of catch-all neighborhood watch for the internet to use. Whereas VDP obviously is the latter. It's going out and saying, okay, we want people to submit issues to us as they find them, and then we'll take those under advisement, we'll remediate them, and we'll carry on based on what we have in our policy, whether it's a Hall of Fame or points or whatever else. I think where scope comes into that is that as an organization, you want to know about all of your risks. Like Neighborhood Watch, it would be like saying, okay, I'm going to participate in my Neighborhood Watch program, but I'm only interested in people telling me things about my front door. Or whatever else. Like you single out a particular piece of your house that you only want to know about, and if anyone tells you about the back window that's open or whatever else, you actually consider those things to be out of scope and treat them unfairly. I think that kind of defeats the purpose. So the idea of having an open scope in a vulnerability disclosure program, that's really the becoming the de facto standard of how we approach these things. It's how we're seeing them be adopted both on our platform and right across the board, and I actually think it's the best thing for the security of the internet overall.
All right, we have time for one more question. Why are more companies turning to vulnerability disclosure programs as the first line of defense?
Yeah, cool. I think in my mind, it's because it's reflective of the actual adversarial landscape. Like when you think about it, if you're a vendor and you've got a connection to the internet, you've got applications that you produced and whatever else, the attackers that you're actually concerned about from a malicious perspective are out there on the internet. The thing that vulnerability disclosure programs basically take advantage of is the fact that those bad guys are interspersed with a bunch of good guys that are wanting to help out. And there's things like information sharing. There's this kind of diversity of creativity and skill set that you're just never going to be able to have in-house, like being able to reach out to the internet and ask for constructive input in the same way that the destructive action would probably come, like along those same model lines. I think that's one of the most powerful things about it. Once you start to, the thing that's interesting about this model is when you explain it to someone for the first time who's in the security space, they hit a point where the light bulb comes on. They're like, oh, wait a sec, this is basically adopting the same model that's made the adversary so effective for all these years, but we're actually turning it into a white hat version that we can use for the purpose of defense. And for that reason, people are turning to VDP and bug bounties more and more and more. It's because it's worked. It's basically taking a model that's worked really well for the bad guys for a long time and creating a defensive version.
All right. Well, that will have to be all for today. Another special thanks to Casey and Jason for their presentation, and also to Bugcrowd for sponsoring this program, and of course to all of you for joining us today. Also, please keep in mind that the webcast will be available for your viewing in a few days at the SC Magazine website under the Events tab at scmagazine.com. Thank you all and have a great day.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.